Welcome to Cockpit2Cowl, the show that explores general aviation safety topics from the combined perspective of flight instructors, pilots, and mechanics, exploring both pilot and aircraft topics to make aviation safer and more enjoyable. I'm Jeff Simon, pilot, AMP, IA, and president of SocialFlight.
Brian Schiff. I've been a flight instructor, Gold SEAL, for 40 years. And to support that hobby, I'm an airline pilot on the side to pay for my weekend hobbies.
Well, Brian, I've been looking forward to this show for a while. I always look forward to this show every month. It's like a regular reunion of our normal chats for everyone to join in on. But tonight is
Yeah.
especially fun because we're going to do some myth busting of our own. Our show title is Common Knowledge Isn't Knowledge. Tell me a little bit.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing is you mentioned our conversations and our chats. Like if we recorded our phone calls, we could probably just play them once a month and just let that air. I think that's kind of a lot of what you and I talk about to just put everybody as a fly on the wall. That's what we're doing now is trying to sum it up, but we ought to record those and just make a podcast out of that. But yeah, common knowledge isn't knowledge, but just because it's common knowledge doesn't mean it's necessarily correct. It's just become local lore and everybody spreads this word. It might be wrong.
Exactly. I want to talk about, I want to kick things off, of course, from the maintenance perspective and talk a little bit about one that I've had some personal experience with recently. And I think one of the things about the idea of kind of what everyone seems to think, what common knowledge is not being accurate, is the fact that it evolves over time, right? We learn things from either technology evolving or the science evolving, or something as simple as people doing studies to see if the truth is really what we think it is.
Right.
And while our last show was about winter, a lot of people are flying less as the cold temperatures and snow and other things that make it more difficult. And one of the topics that has come up and really needs to be busted a bit is when what type of oil really helps you the most when your aircraft is not flying.
I think
So
I remember asking you that too. When I got my airplane, I moved from California to Texas, big climate change. And now all of a sudden I got to worry about these winters and it's really cold. And I remember asking you, so what would you put in your engine when it's not flying at all? Or is it important to go start it and run it a lot?
okay, well, let's start with the oil. And I'll tell you, when I was first an aircraft owner, and then from that point on, like learning and being taught as a mechanic, the thing that I was always taught is, hey, the default is using a straight weight oil, a simple straight weight oil, because that's the heaviest. That's made up of the most good stuff, basically, and that will cling to parts when you're not flying and prevent or at least reduce the amount of corrosion that can happen. Obviously, bare metal parts just corrode. If you look at the brake discs on your car, if you go and you park your car for a little while, go on a trip, you come back to the airport, you look at them, there's like brown rust on there if you've been gone for even a week. And yet, when there's a coating of oil, even if it's pretty thin, it does a really good job at protecting that. So the thought was always trained into me that straight weight oils do the best job of that. Now, multi-weight oils, what we use in our car, what you can also use in your plane, things like Phillips XC20W50, they are made to go across a wide range of temperatures. So a lot of changes in the oil that make that possible, that allow you to start, have really good viscosity when it's cold, but also act like a heavier weight oil when the engine's all warmed up and hot. So it's got all these great benefits. But we always thought that you give up some of those benefits when you walk away from your plane after a flight. And Phillips did a study, and I was fortunate enough to spend time with their scientists and chemists. And it was really fascinating to see that they decided they were going to test this. And they had virtually no skin in the game because they sell both straight weight and multi-weight oils. And what they found when they went and did these tests of literally dipping, spraying these like pieces of metal, leaving them for periods of time, is that in the very, very beginning, like we're talking hours, then yes, a straight weight oil was a little thicker, left a little bigger coating. Only in those first few hours where no corrosion was occurring anyway.
Literally just a few hours, it makes a
Yeah,
difference. And after that, oh my gosh. So
exactly.
Can
And
I
then
hold you real quick? Because the different multi-weight, so you have 20W or 15W50. What does that really mean? So at a cold temperature, it's a different weight than it is at a warmer temperature?
yes, yes, that means that it acts as the lower number, the 20, when it's cold, it acts because when you think about it, we're talking viscosity is the resistance to flow. It's the ability for something to flow. You put honey, it's got like a, high viscosity, it goes, you see it go really slow, right? We want, and when you think about something heat, as you heat it, it moves faster. Well, we want something that gives us the same type of a flow rate at all these different temperatures. And that's what a multi-weight gives you essentially.
So
I'm
I think of
really oversimplifying it.
an advantage of that is that I don't have to heat up the oil to drain it, right? You're saying it's going
Not
to
as
be,
much. I mean, it always helps, right? I mean, this is not
yeah.
like anything is exact at all the different temperatures, but a multi-weight oil will flow if you're looking to drain it much better.
So
So
those are the limits, like it would be 15 to 50, but it could be somewhere in between depending on the temperature of the engine. Those are just
you
the
got
cold
it.
limit and the hot limit. Is that right?
You're a really good student. I always thought you were just a great teacher, but you listen.
There's more up here than just air between these ears.
So yeah, it does that. But what they discovered, which was so really amazing, was that sure, for a really short period of time, it had that sort of stickiness and slower flow on the heavier weight oil. But the minute they went like looked at longer time periods and the time periods that we care about, days and even weeks, what they found was, man, their 20W50 oil did a much better job at protecting components over time than their straight weights did. And so there's your first kind of like myth blown, common knowledge is not knowledge. And that's just the oil itself. We're not talking about additives. We can talk about that in a minute, but that's a really big one that kind of blew my mind.
Well, I certainly want to talk about additives because that was something. I mean, I actually had to replace a cylinder on my engine. I think we mentioned this a few episodes back, and I was worried that while I wasn't flying my airplane for a long time, first of all, for an airplane to sit for 5 weeks or 6 weeks, that's a crime to begin with. It's just sad, but it does happen. It happened to me. My airplane sat for a while, and it was in a corrosive environment, and sure enough, it started having problems as a result of corrosion inside the cylinder.
Yeah, well, our engines are always a group of compromises during the design. And every
Yeah.
different types of engines have different sort of, I'll sort of say kind of vulnerabilities. They're not necessarily weak spots, but over time,
Yeah.
everything's going to have a problem in one area or another. And Lycoming engines have the cam is up top in the engine as opposed to Continentals where it's lower. And
Yeah.
that means that cam that you're talking about is it's very vulnerable to losing that protective coating over
Mm.
time. And you can't get to the lifters, without cracking the case open. So that's the kind of thing you worry about. And that leads us to other things like what can we do as owners to add additives that will also help protect our engines, both against wear as well as against corrosion.
Okay, so those additives help the oil stay on those metal parts longer. Is that kind of a thought of what
Well,
happens?
so they don't actually help the oil stay on there. They actually provide their own benefits. They have their own chemicals that on an atomic level, on a chemical level, get in there and like bond to prevent corrosion from happening. But they also have the ability of different additives of bonding to prevent scuffing or scraping, other things that help. So, additives, when we think about it for our cars, they have a huge amount of packages of different things. For our aircraft, it's a much more limited, and so there are different things that you can add.
Like CamGuard or stuff like that? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so a couple things. If you're talking about Lycomings, the most common one people hear about is Lycomings LW16702. That is that kind of AV blend is one that people think about. That's this additive that is an anti-scuff agent, which really sort of started when Lycoming was having some issues with their H2AD engine, which had lifters that had problems. So you can think of this as it's not an oil. It's an additive that helps that initial scraping and helps from any kind of scuffing between things. So that bonds when you have it in there to the
Okay.
metal and helps that. So we think about anti-friction is one way of thinking about that. But that
Okay.
isn't necessarily corrosion. CamGuard's a great additive that's out there that not only does some stuff with friction, but really focuses on corrosion. And that also has things that bond to the surface and prevent or resist at least corrosion in addition to the film. So,
But
both
you
of
said
these
light
are good.
combing. What about Continental?
Well, so Continental, you focus more if they have their own, everybody's got their own types of things, but when
Why
it
wouldn't
comes
they?
to the corrosion,
Yeah.
it's less of a concern on the cam and more just kind of in the cylinders or things like that in
So
general.
multi-weight oils have smaller molecules, which provide more surface area coverage than heavier straight weights. That's what Tom had said in the chat. That's how I know that.
Okay.
That's getting deeper than
Well,
I want to get. But
so
also, someone mentioned they want a tour of your garage, and I'm thinking that might be kind of fun.
yeah, we can take a tour of your garage. They're talking about you, right?
Oh, yeah, it must have been me. Yeah,
So, here's the thing that really matters and gets back to our myth busting here for tonight.
yeah,
A lot of people have this idea that more is better. That the idea if you put more additives in, can I do both? Can I do Avalon and CamGuard? Can I put it all together? Can I get an oil that comes with an additive in it? Like Phillips 66 has their Victory line of oils that comes with the Lycoming LW16702 in the oil. And then it's like, well,
yeah.
what if I keep adding stuff? What was really fascinating about what I've learned from, again, the same folks as we went and talked, and I've talked to both the Aeroshell folks and learned all from their scientists and experts as well as from Phillips. It's really fascinating stuff. I think one of the most interesting things that I learned was when they look at this, it's not like everyone can fit in the room, come to the party with all these additives. You have a limited, molecular, I'm not pronouncing that right. Sorry, I'm stumbling. But you have a limited area at which each of these molecules can bond. And so you kind of have to choose what you want in the right ratio beside or you're going to crowd out what else you need to do. And that's why they explain that it's a real balance. And they tested what percentages you put in of each of these compounds and when it helps and when it starts hurting instead of
Oh,
helping.
wow. Okay.
And yeah, it's a Goldilocks thing.
Wow.
Everything's a
So you got to get
Goldilocks
just
thing.
right. Yeah. And so is that a recommended number that you can get? I mean, are you supposed to try it yourself as a pilot or
It
aircraft owner?
the idea is go with what they tell you. There's
Do
two
what you're told. Okay.
conditions, right?
Okay.
Go just, and they'll tell you what the ratio is, but there's two conditions you're looking at. Normal operation, which includes some normal downtime, and storage. And each one has different recommendations, and you have products available for it. Just pay attention to that and don't think like, oh, well, why don't I just use the storage all the time and I'm going to be good no matter what happens. Everything is the Goldilocks approach.
I see. What if so 10 or 2050 in the winter, 100 in the summer? Because if we get really big temperature variance, would you recommend doing it that way, or would you use one all year long?
I used to say that, and I'll say this: my understanding of the science has evolved, and some of the testing that I would say has totally evolved. Personally, I am a Philips XC20W50 year-round. I use CamGuard additive. I don't change anything because I have not been shown anything to show that there's an advantage to going to a single weight, other than in some cases maybe you save a dollar or two.
Okay, and I saw in the testimonial in the chat there that someone has used 2050 for 18 years, not a problem straight, 18 years with not one problem with the engine, not 1 ounce of corrosion. And
It,
you can't speak, you can't argue with success, but also a lot of the details, a lot of us dumb pilots just want to know, just tell me what to do. Tell me what to
yeah.
put in it. I don't want all the details. I don't want to know why or when or how. I'm very good at doing exactly what I'm told. So some of the things I just need to be told, okay, put this much of this in, put this much of that. That's what I'll do. Uh,
Yeah.
the why is ancillary for me as a pilot, but I know a lot of people like you are pilots and mechanics, and they know a whole lot more about it. But
Yeah,
also,
and it really, and again, with the
yeah,
Lycoming engine, it helps to have that 16702. You can get something like Phillips Victory, multi-weight. They sell that in a
yeah,
20W50, and you're just good to go. So you could do something like that. If you're concerned about corrosion, if you're running like Continental, things like that also, you can, of course, do like a regular one, add CamGuard, just in the amount that they have. But again, this is all just about be
yeah.
open-minded to evolving science. Be
All right.
open-minded to new products and the studies that they do. Don't just listen to like a mechanic in a shop that hasn't read anything recently and is just saying, nope, it sticks to the components.
Yeah, so just because we were taught that back in the 1930s doesn't mean it applies today. Sometimes we actually learn and progress, and we're educated a little bit more on things, and we come up with new ways to do things that are, believe it or not, better, and also products that are better as well as we learn more. This is a relatively young industry, so we are certainly evolving, and I think it's important that people go with whatever the current information is, because the more current, the more up to date, the more we've probably learned.
Yeah, I think the other last thing that I would say on that, sort of on that topic, is this idea that's also, I think, outdated and has been proven to be incorrect. And that's the idea that if you can't fly, you somehow drive out to the airport and like move your prop by hand, and you're somehow helping your engine by doing that. And that is not the case
Okay,
at
so I'm gonna
all.
stop doing that now, but doesn't it spread the oil all over everything by churning it up like that?
You know, it really doesn't, because you're not turning it up, right? It'd be one thing, and still not necessarily a good thing, if you went and pulled all your plugs out and ran the starter and spun everything around there so that you were really exercising the oil pump and spraying the fuel. But even then, you're really not going to accomplish anything positive. And so that is not recommended. All you're going to do is scrape things off of
Yeah.
whatever you have left.
Okay. And I've heard some people talking about the Marvel mystery oil. Is that
No.
your thought?
I am not going to be someone that sits here and talks about, like, unapproved, undocumented things, because people talk about what it can be, and there's lots of stuff you can look
Yeah.
at online and find out what the real additive, what the real chemical composition is of mystery oil. And you'll see that, look, people make a lot of money selling the
Yeah.
actual certified products. They'd be using this if it actually worked. And when you talk to those oil companies, they will tell you, no, we would have added it if that was a good chemical to add.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. Now I want to turn tables on you. Enough about all
Okay.
this side of things. I want to talk about some flying mystery, I guess, things
So
to,
tell me your common knowledge, and we'll
common
try to
knowledge
shoot.
and myths. Let's start with the big one. Um, should I really be climbing? I have this gut from things even that I was taught, and I keep being told it's not true, but I have my own my own resistance to doing it, of climbing above your altitude, pushing over and coming down, even if it's a
Oh,
little bit.
getting on the
What's the
step.
real story?
That's interesting you say that, because I know my dad did a pretty big study on that, because that was a big thing that was very popular back, maybe 30, 40 years ago. Getting on the step, get past your altitude and get back down. All that really does is reward you with a little bit. You get to cruise speed maybe a little bit faster from the time that you lower your nose. So you get up, you're still climbing, you're climbing, you lower the nose. Now you get a little bit of downhill. You cannot create energy. So that's a fad, total fallacy. You cannot get to a faster speed. You cannot get to, you might get up to speed faster from when you lower your nose, but you're going to be spending a little bit more time climbing to get over there and back down. It is a feel good thing only. In
Okay.
fact, we've
I don't want
studied.
I want it to be true. I just want to let you know that.
I know
I
you
want to be
do.
on the record that I don't want this myth busted. And
I know.
I was never taught you will get to a faster speed, your plane will go faster. Like that was never that's I don't think anybody, that's crazy talk.
Well,
But
I've heard it. I hear
okay,
that.
all right, fine. But
Yeah.
I was taught that you would get to your cruise speed faster, net, meaning including the extra 100 feet of climb, if you did that. And you're saying, no, if you actually start rounding out 50 feet before you get to your altitude and reach your final altitude there, you'll actually get there faster.
Yeah, and arguably, we did this test a lot. Dad did it quite a bit, many, many times, trying to level off and timing all that, and it was identical. It makes you feel better. It's a feel-good thing. If you go up and test fly it, we ought to come when I come out there to your neck of the woods. We'll go fly your Bonanza, and we'll time it. We'll do some real official, real careful testing on that, and
Okay.
know when you pass through that altitude when you would have otherwise leveled off, and we'll time it to when you get to a certain cruise speed, whatever your equilibrium speed is. The best thing to do is the old way of teaching it is pitch, trim, and power. Lower the nose at your altitude, leave full power. Now, what I do see pilots do is as soon as they lower the nose, they power back. Now, you can do that. You can set cruise speed as soon as you lower the nose, I'm sorry, cruise power. As soon as you lower the nose and level off, now it's going to take a lot longer because you're not using full power to accelerate.
Mm.
Lower the nose, leave it full power. Let that power help you accelerate. Be trimming while that's happening, because a lot of pilots don't even trim it yet. And then as it approaches your normal cruise speed, power back and set your normal cruise power, and it should maintain that speed. You will find not a whole lot of difference in the timing if you do that versus passing through the altitude, climbing a little bit, getting back down, watching your speed come up. For a given power setting and a given altitude, weight, CG, performance, everything, you're going to have the same speed regardless of how you level off.
I really, really like that. I think with the tip that you've given me for this evening is what you just said about don't reduce power yet,
Yeah,
because there's this, especially if it's complex and environment, or you're an IFR or something. There seems to I always feel this pressure to, once I arrive, get everything straightened out, right? Like get everything cleaned up, get a steady state as to where
yeah,
you're going to be. And so there's this push internally, which probably should not be there, of like, okay, now I'm level, trim for level, turn, reduce the prop, get everything set into that. But you're right, it would be so much better and more efficient if I left all of that, did trim, but left all of that, including the prop, to get
yeah.
me to that final steady state before I then consider myself ready to set up at this point.
Right. And generally a rule of thumb is if you have some pretty good performance and you're climbing pretty good, uh, take about, if you're climbing at 500 feet a minute, for example, take 10% of that. So 50 feet before your cruise altitude, start lowering the nose, do it gradually. You want your passengers to not even notice that this is happening. Leave climb power. If you leave climb power, you're going to do the same thing as getting up on the step and coming back down, because you're leaving climb power a little bit longer, but you're also climbing longer than descending. So
Hmm.
the net is the same, but leave the power in there. There are some airplanes, if you're flying really close to the edge, say close to your service ceiling, and close to your max gross weight, everything is right on the edge. And I know that you like to teach and learn. You like pilots to try flying to the edge of the envelope, not just right in the middle. Know how your aircraft performs at the edge. So if you level off when you're at middle CG range all the time, and now you're at max gross weight and you're going about as high as you can get, and you level off, you are going to see some dismal performance there. But you need to be patient. And that's the time where if you pull the power back when you level off, you might see a reduction in speed at that time. And that's a bad time to have that happen. So
That that
leaving
makes
full
sense.
power till you get to the cruise speed you're expecting to see, and then power back and set the cruise power. If you're in a fixed pitch prop, for example, you level off, pull your power back to say 2,400 RPM. Uh, you're going to see it as you accelerate. Now it's going to creep up and change as your prop becomes more efficient as you're accelerating over a long period of time. And then you're going to take a lot longer to, okay, now I'm 2450. I got to set that back. Why is it climbing on me? It's because you're accelerating. But
Yeah.
a lot of times pilots just level off. They don't look at that. But
Well, it
while
seems
it's,
if you let it get up to speed like that, it's really going to simplify all the actions you have to take.
yeah, yeah,
There's another thing also, for folks with older autopilots like I happen to have, where things like altitude hold are based on your static pressure, and it's all analog and frankly 50 years old
yeah,
electronics. One of the things I've noticed, and it again, it shouldn't be this way. It is just due to 50-year-old electronics and things that are not perfect.
yeah,
But if if I do all that, if I round right off to my altitude and I still have yet to accelerate, and I try to lock in my altitude, lock in all these other things, and then the plane speeds up, it's not going to do a good job holding that altitude. It's not, I mean, everything's changing. Your airspeed is increasing dramatically. I feel there's probably an effect on the static port that it's looking at. There's things that, who knows?
yeah.
But for one reason or another, or the fact that it just needs to trim at that point in order to do it because you're accelerating.
Yeah, it does need to trim, and that's the biggest problem. And so sometimes it will not do a good job if you don't have an aircraft that's changing the trim for you as you level off. But sometimes it needs to feel a certain force before it trims, and it's getting to that point. So then you're going to see a little wonkiness.
Yeah.
Depends on your equipment, how good it is and how much accelerating you have to do. But it could take a long time to accelerate to cruise if you set your power right at level off and you haven't
Yeah.
quite attained the cruise speed. Some people leave full power the whole time and get what they get. I know some people
I
who fly like that too.
Wait a minute. What do you mean some people? Like there's a
Probably
footprint
most.
on my throttle. The throttle is there to
Yeah.
push in when you go to take off and then to pull out when you want to land. Like
Right. And then so it's just the prop that you adjust, right?
yeah, and mixture, of
But
course.
don't let your prop get any, slower than your manifold or
So
faster
that was my
manifold
next
pressure,
question. All
right?
right, tell me over square.
Yeah, right. So 25 square, 24 square. Certainly, I would never cruise at 25 inches of manifold pressure and 2400 RPM because now I'm going to break the engine, right?
Right. Yeah. There, we have to say something right up front to make sure that we're kind of covered here because there are POHs, there's, pilots operating handbooks out there of that specifically have instructions having to do with when you
Yeah.
can have your manifold pressure greater than or not to, depending on your power setting. So I really do not want to
Yeah.
contradict if it's in writing as an official way to operate that aircraft from the manufacturer.
I think that's a caveat we should say for everything we're talking about is follow your manufacturer's procedures in the AFM or the POH for sure.
Right. But aside from that, no, you do not have to worry on its at face value, like just looking at it as a generality about having essentially more power than your RPM. That's, if we think about your manifold pressure being higher than your RPM, that happens every time we take off.
Right.
Right. And
Right. And there's
especially
no
a
time
fixed
limit.
pitch propeller aircraft. That's the thing.
Yeah.
There's so many aircraft out there. The majority of the fleet are probably fixed pitch aircraft, fixed pitch
Yeah.
propeller aircraft, which by default, because you can't control it, they did not happen to install a manifold pressure instrument. So you
But
don't
there's
know
still
what it
manifold
is.
pressure in there?
And so the reality is that's exactly how fixed pitch propellers work every time you take off, every time
Right.
you climb. This is the way it works. So
Yeah.
in that level, no, that's not something that you worry about. Where it does matter is that there are certain engines, especially, for example, Continental released a bulletin on this, where going below a certain RPM is not good for the engine. It's not designed to do that. Um, and in Continentals, they tell
Even the
you,
low power settings?
well, correct it. They generally are focusing on higher power settings,
Oh, okay.
but
Okay. I didn't know if it was
at
a
the
vibration thing or a torque thing.
well, you know what it really comes down to is I've talked to the engineers involved in the original design, some really fantastic folks that are no longer, working in the industry actively, but were the folks who designed a lot of this and explained to me what the rationale is. And there are counterweights that are built into the engine to help handle the torsional vibrations and the stresses on the crankshaft, and they simply aren't effective or as
Oh,
effective at
okay.
lower RPMs. And so they look at that and they say, this isn't, it's published as many certified documents and guidance as here's the number, right? Do not
Yeah.
operate below 2300 RPM at these manifold pressure things. But that's not how science works. That's not how stresses work. That's just where we've decided to draw a line. And the reality is there's a curve at the ability for the design to do its job and mitigate stresses. And in this case, I personally operate, I'm climbing at 2,700 RPM and I'm cruising at 2,500 RPM. And that's based on these discussions and talking to these folks about what's really going on inside the engine. Some people may have a different way. Do
Yeah.
what you feels right for you, but there is guidance out there where there are hard limits saying, hey, below this RPM, you are asking for things built into the engine to do things they cannot do at these low RPMs.
Yeah. And some of the jet engines I fly, they actually cannot operate in certain ranges because the vibration will be too much. For
That's an
some reason,
excellent
they just
point.
can't balance. They're not in harmony or whatever. And you have a no transgression zone, or you can transgress it, but you cannot stop there and leave the engine at that power setting. And I guess
Yeah.
the important thing is know your airplane, read your manual, and know exactly what the limits are
Yeah,
when you're
there's
ready.
a placard right on the panel when I had the Macaulay prop on there says no operation 2350 to 2450. These are things
Yeah.
these at certain pressure settings. These are things that they learn, usually after it's out in the field for a while.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then they realize like, oh, hey, look at that. We got a resonance and it
Yeah.
caused a lot of damage.
Yeah. There's some chat going on about pulling the prop through before starting a cold engine. How about that? Because I guess they're saying there that Cessna has said that, if your book says to do it, then obviously, like we're saying here, follow your AFM. But if you're going to start a cold engine, or is that something that was written in the 60s and new aircraft just don't do it anymore, pulling the prop through a few times before starting a cold engine?
Okay, so this isn't going to be a good answer for a lot of people who are listening to that, but my answer is don't start a cold engine, right?
That's a,
Preheat your
right.
engine. If you
Yeah.
literally are sitting there and trying to say that I have an issue with getting oil through, remember again, you're moving that oil pump slowly,
Yeah.
very slowly. Like think about how fast you're going to pull through a prop under compression
Right.
versus like all you're going to do is prime it at best. And even then you're not really priming
That's
technically.
fair. That makes a lot
Um,
of sense. We talked about that last
yeah,
month. So yeah,
yeah.
watch our last month if you haven't seen.
Yeah, Jeff, shut up and tell everyone to watch the last show.
There you go. There you go. So we were talking about flying up toward, and I had mentioned this, towards your absolute ceiling. Um, and that's something that I've also seen a little bit of myths on. People are afraid to go to their absolute ceiling of their aircraft because they think the airplane is on the verge of a stall.
Hmm.
Um, I've heard several people say that, and that's something that I'll talk about. I like, since I've learned from you that you really want to see people fly toward the limits, I like to take people toward the service ceiling of their airplane. The absolute ceiling is where you just cannot get any climb, where any increase in speed will result in a descent, and any decrease in speed will result in a descent. Of course, you're at full power. So that's your absolute ceiling. You just can't climb anymore. The aerodynamics of the airplane, the engine, it just can't do anymore. You're not about to stall. You might be well above stall speed, but aerodynamically, you cannot create enough lift to stay, to climb. You have no excess thrust. So at that point, like I said, any increase in airspeed will result in a descent, and any decrease in airspeed will result in a descent. It's a fun thing to demonstrate when you're showing someone to take the aircraft to their service ceiling, the absolute service ceiling.
That that's an excellent point. I'll add one quick thing to that, and that is if you're going to be operating in these different regimes that you're not necessarily used to doing, like taking your aircraft that you're usually at 3 or 4 thousand feet up to 16,000 feet,
Yeah,
um, other things do happen, and you have to be prepared for it. Things that are fairly normal. I have normal meaning normal
yeah,
operation to be aware of. One of those, for example, has to do with you could switch tanks in a low wing aircraft and find that all of a sudden your engine stops because you weren't paying attention and you have vapor in the lines. You do have issues that happen there, and there's normal procedure like hit the fuel pump, get it through.
yeah.
If you haven't used that tank, I can tell you I've personally experienced that with someone who hadn't flown in that situation, took off on one tank, went up there, and surprise, surprise, flipped over at a very high altitude, and the engine stopped. And all it
Oh,
was
yeah.
the need to go and get that pump started.
Right. There's a lot of different physics up there, as there is a lot of different physics down here. If you've got a P210 or Malibu or something where you routinely are flying up in the 20s, then all of a sudden, for weather or some reason, you're flying down at 3 to 6,000 feet. You're going to have different things there that you need to worry about as well. Same thing.
Yeah, one of them has to do with the way that you lean out your engine. Um,
Yeah.
when you're higher, you're at lower power settings, right? Because your manifold pressure is going to be lower by default. You can only
Right.
produce a certain amount. And for people that are used to one normal profile, this is something that I have seen bit people, and I have had to catch myself even doing it, is people are used to that normal profile. They're up there, they're like, oh, I only at 65% power and I can do whatever I want to do. And then all of a sudden they're like, hey, let's go whale watching. Um, and now you're at 1,000 feet. Obviously we're out
Yeah.
here in Massachusetts and Cape Cod, and you're cruising around there. Well, if you're doing that and you're not paying attention to where your mixture settings are, your engine's got a lot of power being produced, or the
Yeah.
ability, at least, let's say the ability to produce a lot of power,
Yeah.
which means even if you pull it back, you're doing low maneuvers, and then you just put in all that power, go to climb. Well, you're way over, you're 75% or more of your power. Now you can cause detonation if you are not in a safe mixture setting. Not a lot of people think about that.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, that is an interesting point. I don't think I've given that a lot of thought either.
Hey, I want
I
to
did
ask
learn
you about
once.
something.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't see you. And that is the FAA recently came out with a really positive endorsement and recommendation having to do with angle of attack indications. And you
Mhm.
talked about flying at high altitude. So tell me a little bit about what would happen to folks that wanted to explore that service ceiling and what they'd see with their angle of attack indication.
Well, and that would be a good proof of what I'm talking about. A lot of times you'll think you are at the verge of a stall when you're at your absolute ceiling, but you'll notice that the angle of attack is satisfied fairly nicely. Um, I've not operated like I have flown. I've flown the Learjet up to its service ceiling, the Lear 20 models, the 23, 24. If you don't get up there, you're not going to make any kind of range because it just burns those straight pipes. Jet engines burn so much gas down low. I mean, you can't make it from Southern California to Northern California unless you get up into the 40s, 40,000 feet. And at that point, I remember uh, your stall speed rises as you get up there, and your Mach, so you're getting close to Mach, and so you got this narrow window of where you can fly. Too fast, you get Mach tuck. Too slow, you'll get a stall buffet. So you will be closer to your critical angle of attack, but you're not right on it, right there at the limit. That's one of the things that I thought was very interesting. Also, I learned the hard way in one of those Learjets that you can't pull the power back at altitude the same way you can down low. I did it. I just kind of slowly closed the throttle, but I did it the same way I did it, or I should say, I know it's the power lever, thrust lever, but I pulled it back a little bit too quickly for a straight pipe jet engine up at 41,000 feet, and left engine just quit, just coughed and quit. You cannot do that. Those are older fuel computers. I don't even know if there's any of those engines still operating out there, but it was a characteristic that I was not aware of until I learned it the hard way. So.
Wow. That is definitely a good one to know.
Yeah. So you were talking about switching tanks,
Yes.
and
Um,
I've had a kind, you know where I'm going with this, because I had a conversation with a friend who's like, I want to make sure I get every ounce of fuel out of that tank. I'm gonna let it run dry. What are your thoughts on that?
I have qualified thoughts on that, and that is there's so on one level, there's nothing wrong with doing that, and in fact, I think it is important that everyone who either owns an aircraft or flies an aircraft that has switchable tanks know what that really means, what their fuel capacity is out of a tank. So if you really don't know what your tanks hold, how long they last, what the capacity actually is, I think you're
Yeah.
doing yourself a disservice from a safety perspective. My qualified answer to that is I don't believe in taking unnecessary risk. And unnecessary risk to me, the way that I fly and how I recommend for other people means you take off on one tank, which you've now tested on the ground. You know that it's working. You don't, this is your known good tank. And you don't burn
Yeah.
that out and then ever switch to the other tank all of a sudden and just hope everything's going to work. You
That's a good
take
point.
some out of that
Yeah.
and now you switch to the other tank. Well, at that point, I consider you've kind
Yeah.
of already gone through your checks. You know that the fuel is good. You know that the tank is everything's working for you. You know that your fuel valve is working because now you shift over to the other tank. Now, if you want to burn that other tank down, being aware that of what's going to happen and that you're not going to scare your passengers, they know what's prepared, and you're prepared to switch back, you're not taking an unnecessary risk because you're going back to a known quantity in your other tank.
Yeah.
So that I think works. And all these ideas, if you want to talk again about like old wives' tales or like myth busting or common knowledge, the idea that by burning down the fuel too low, you're going to get into bad fuel, you're going to get contaminants that are either floating on the top or the bottom. Simply, there's no evidence for that. The
Interesting.
logic doesn't add up.
I have a psychological fear of all the sludge that's down there in the bottom of my tank, and I don't like to use the fuel in the bottom third of the tank.
So
Period.
tell
But
me. This is
I'm
one of
kidding.
those things that I want to do a drawing with you and say like, okay, here's how you're picking this up. Show me the stuff
It's
that you think you're about to get.
it's
That's and if you're even if you're true, you're not, but even if you're right, Don't you want to slowly get small pieces of that out over time anyway? I mean,
Not
like,
through my engine. It's psychological. It's just a thing about that bottom part of the engine. It's like the last part of my cup of coffee. It's like I know what's down here. I'm not drinking that, you know.
okay,
It's
okay, but
always worse.
and where do you think your engine is sipping from? You think that the
Right.
pickup tube goes lower and lower and lower as you fly until it gets to the bottom?
That's a good point. It's always sucking from the bottom, isn't it?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
now I'm not scared anymore. But here's the thing. Seriously, though, I don't think if you need to plan to use that fuel and you need to use that fuel to make it to your destination, I think you've made a mistake or a poor judgment. This is my opinion. Uh,
You're
Earlier in the
right.
game.
Yes, yes. Those that wind up in fields without fuel have made poor life choices. That is
Right.
correct. Um,
Right.
that said, uh, it goes back to what I said before, which is know thine aircraft.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is you have usable fuel, you have actual total fuel that is published for your tank, and then you have what the real number is, what it actually does. You should know those numbers, not
Well, what is
because
the
that's how
unusable
you want to plan
fuel?
your flight, but because that's what you want to know in an emergency.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I don't want to make a joke right in the middle of that serious uh, uh, point, which is I agree with totally. But what I was going to ask was, how does the unusable fuel stay out of the usable fuel? I mean, what happens if they mix together? What happens? I'm just kidding.
They don't get along well at all. You're correct. Yeah,
Right. I
you for
think,
some reason it seems like you've got usable fuel, unusable fuel, and mystery fuel,
yeah.
right?
And then
Which
there's
is
some, like in your airplane, you just don't want to be below that level because when you turn onto the runway, you're going to unport right before you take off, right?
exactly. Well,
Yeah.
but again, like good to know, like good to know what it means. I mean, usable fuel is based
Yeah.
on normal operations that don't have to do with skidding, slipping, steep
Yeah.
turns, like all this other kind of stuff. And so that you've got this other part which is
Right.
actually available in an emergency
Right.
for you to use. And then it turns out you actually have
Yeah.
more and you need to know what that is.
Yeah, I love the comments in the chat. I think you guys are doing some fantastic. If you're watching the recording of this, I'm going to encourage you to join live because the comments in the chat, you guys are awesome. I mean, there's some good stuff in there. There's great conversations going on. I wish we could read it all. Someone did mention that they wished I would explain coffin corner a little bit, and then someone else said, "Oh, I had to look that up. What is coffin corner?" Well, it's not the corner of the coffin. It's basically what I was starting to describe before where you're getting the airplane up so high near its service ceiling, and any increase in speed will move the center of lift forward on the wing because you're getting some separation on the back because of it's going so fast, you're getting a mock separation there, and you get what's called a mock tuck. And it'll actually be a little bit of a mock buffet, and then the nose will go down. The MD-80 used to have a little bit of a trim system that would automatically trim when you got close to that, and you'd see a little worm popping out. They called it the worm is showing itself because you would see that it's trimming to avoid a mock tuck. So too fast, and you get a mock buffet. Too slow, and you get down to the stall. Well, stall speed rises, your Mach speed, your Mach limit comes down, and you're getting up there, and this is coffin corner when you only have plus or minus 5 or 10 knots to operate the aircraft. And if you have an engine failure like at that position, you had better be ready to get the nose down, start an immediate descent to stay in that airspeed range. So it's just something to think about. That's what that is. Someone had asked about. I know that maybe many of our viewers aren't flying jets or whatever, but the higher you get high altitude flying, we're getting more and more propeller driven airplanes that are flying higher, these days. So it's just something to think about with high altitude flying.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense.
And I had also mentioned about, if you have to use that last bit of fuel, then you probably had some poor planning. I also feel the same way about VX. If you have to climb at VX to actually make it, then you've probably made a bad decision. Now, I know your airport is something different. Where you fly, you've got some trees, and there are a lot of airports like that where you've got obstacles out there and it's not necessarily dangerous. But you had asked me about the technique for leaving. What would you do normally to leave an airport like that where you got trees out there and obstacles?
Well, that's my question actually kicked back at you, which has to do with what the efficiency is. And I think this is kind of similar to what you said about like, do you get on, is getting on step or is getting to, what's the most efficient use of the
Yeah.
aircraft in that? Now, I'm not saying that I fly as like a really short strip by any means. It's 2,900, it's 20, it's nearly 3,000 feet.
Yeah.
It
But you have
does
trees
have
at the end?
trees. It is a black hole at night and whatever, but I love
Mhm.
my airport. It's Minuteman Airport out in Stowe, Massachusetts. And um, that said, it is wise in that environment without a lot of options as to where you're going to go in an emergency to get
Yeah.
up as quick as you can. You don't want to dawdle in there. You need to, there's not a lot of options. So you really
Altitude is
do,
money.
yeah. Yeah. So that said, my question to you is, I have seen aircraft owners out of that airport and pilots do all sorts of different techniques. Uh, Owners
I
with
bet.
older pipers like to
Yeah.
sometimes accelerate down the runway and then grab that Johnson bar for the flaps and yank it up, and it pops the aircraft up, and they use that technique.
Yeah.
Others do this thing where you're accelerating up like it's soft field, although it's certainly not. It's a gorgeous runway. You pop up,
Yeah.
lower the nose, you accelerate, and you keep accelerating as much as you can till you get there, and then they think they're fighter pilots and pull back
Yeah.
and shoot over it. What is the safest and best technique when you really do want altitude?
Do what the book says. Now, here's the thing, because different airplanes are different. That's why I say that as a caveat. It depends on the airplane you're flying. Certainly, a little bit of popping the flaps to get over at the last minute with the Johnson bar will work. You're adding lift. You're changing the lift equation on the wing by doing that. There's no argument that it'll work. You're also adding a little bit of drag. So you better be ready to recover from that once you clear those trees. Now, if you speed up in ground effect, I think you want to be in ground effect. Think of a soft field takeoff. Now, the way I teach it is we're going to maintain something, then we're going to maintain something else, and then we're going to maintain another thing. It's just one maintain after another. The first thing we're going to do is maintain full power. Next thing we're going to do is maintain the center line, and we're going to maintain full back pressure on the control wheel. We're talking about a tricycle gear airplane. It's different in a tail dragger, of course. So as soon as the nose wheel comes off the ground, you want to relax that. Now you want to maintain that tricycle attitude with the nose wheel off the ground. The idea is to protect that nose wheel. This is the quickest you can get off the surface, right? Like a soft field takeoff. That's what you want to do. As soon as you lift off, you don't really have the speed you want to climb at, but now you have less drag of rolling on the surface. So you level off. Yes, you're in ground effect, and yes, that will help you. So now you maintain altitude. That altitude is like 2 or 3 feet above the runway. You maintain that until you see the speed you want, and then you maintain that speed. I don't like going to a speed that's faster than you want and then pulling up and doing a zoom climb because you're going to lose that speed. You're putting yourself in a situation that you better be ready to recover from as soon as that energy wanes. Also, the added speed from doing that in preparation for a zoom climb by going really fast, you've added a lot of drag. I mean, just think of the drag curve where the parasite drag increases with an increase in airspeed. So you've only got so much energy in the wing and in the engine. And again, pulling that Johnson bar adds a little bit of energy by changing the lift equation. I don't want to say energy, but it does add lift. But if you go fast and then do a zoom climb, you've actually destroyed or wasted some of your energy with that drag that builds up from flying fast. So bottom line is rotate, level off, get to VX or VY. The book would say VX. I don't like climbing at VX unless you have to. I try not to put myself in a position where you have to, because the frightening thing is if you lose an engine at VX at 50 feet, you're going to pancake and crash. There's videos on it. There's one on my YouTube channel, and I've talked about this. In fact, Dad wrote an article called Nick's VX. I don't like the idea of it. I think if you have to do that, you're somewhere you shouldn't be.
Hmm.
I like VX as an emergency speed to clear terrain or something that you weren't expecting, weather, clouds, or whatever. It's a academic thing that is the best, the most amount of altitude per distance traveled, where VY is the most amount of altitude per time. And VY is certainly not going to work. I like something between VX and VY, knowing that if I had to back it off to VX, I can. So that's kind of what I would do. I would, again, do a soft field technique, accelerate to somewhere between VX and VY and climb. If you have a Johnson bar and you can do manual flaps like that, and use that as something in your hip pocket, but something you shouldn't have to do to clear the trees. If you do, maybe that's not the place you should be flying that airplane.
Right. So ultimately, with the exception of the idea that you're doing this quite kind of step into ground
Yeah.
effect, you're still advocating do a smooth procedure rather than something that is meant to like hop you over something.
Yeah, I think you're actually doing more harm than good. I'd like to do some flight testing with that to prove it, but theoretically,
Mhm.
uh, building up all that speed, you're adding drag. And so you're wasting energy that way. The more drag you have, they're wasting energy. L over D max is your best glide speed. It's very close to VY usually. VY is going to give you the best rate of climb, but you don't want to travel that far that fast. So something slower will work a little bit better. Obviously, VX is the best you can do, the most altitude you can gain for distance traveled. And if it becomes an issue, that's the speed you want. I don't recommend going faster than that and then pulling back to it like a Zoom climb, but I do recommend a little bit faster than VX, a little bit slower than VY. I think that works best. Again, it may vary in your airplane.
Got it. I've got
Yeah.
one more question for you on this technique side, and that is I
Okay.
know a lot of pilots that believe that slipping an airplane puts them in danger of stalling, especially at low air speeds.
Yeah, one thing I do when I check people out in my airplane, I have a Citabria, and when I fly with someone in the Citabria, I show them we're going to do some stalls, simple stalls, and we're going to do accelerated stalls, and we'll do turning just while we're turning, coordinated. We'll do a stall, and it's no big deal. And then I like to dispel that myth. Now it depends on the airplane. What will happen is in high wing and low wing, I got a great webinar on slips and skids that you should watch. I did with Mark King. He's the master at this, and he taught me a lot of what I know. But you can cancel out the aileron, and you'll get a roll tech, moment because the aileron's canceled out in the slip. It doesn't mean you're in a spin or you're losing control of the airplane. Technically, in a slip, you're kind of holding the airplane away from a spin. It's too much rudder that will cause an aircraft to spin. When you have in a slip, you're holding too much aileron and not enough or arguably opposite rudder, holding it the other way. Now, if the airplane's going to lose control effectiveness, you will see it start rolling the other way. And some people, and it might happen quick, but it's not going to spin or stall. You break that stall, you're going to have immediate control of the aircraft.
Hmm.
So what I demonstrate in my airplane is we'll just enter a slip, a normal, kick bank and then kick the nose up, and we'll start coming down and pull it back and stall the airplane and hold it in a stall. And the airplane just gladly just falls down there in a stall and a slip and nothing happens.
Yeah. I think that it's fascinating thing to experience. I learned it in my Grumman where
Yeah.
I had not really I just hadn't explored the envelope there, and then someone taught me that, and the idea of
Yeah.
rudder to the floor and cranking over the aileron, and all of a sudden it just was like, oh my God, this has opened up so many new
Yeah,
places to
you're
bring my
holding it
plane
away from.
into.
Yeah, I mean a spin. If you're in a skid, let's say you just got all this left rudder going, it's going like this, and you're holding opposite aileron, and now you're holding it into a skidding turn, just like a car, like you're skidding because you're turning too fast and you're not banking enough, or the freeway ramp isn't banked, and you start going to the outside of the turn, and that's where you're going to go right into the direction of bank and you have no time to recover. Whereas slip, if you get into a stall and you do lose some control effectiveness and the airplane starts going, you have like from this bank, you have all the way till over here to do some kind of recovery. If you're in a skid like this, a cross-controlled skid, it's going to break over that way. You just don't have the time to recover from it. But don't be afraid of slips. If you are, go up with a CFI and practice them. Come on out here to the DFW area and go up with me and my Citabria. I'll show you.
Be careful, you're gonna have a long waiting list on that invitation.
I already have one, but that's okay. I like any reason to fly.
No doubt. All right. Well, you got any other questions having to do with the mechanical aspect of things, or anything you want to chat about when it comes to mysteries or things that I can help
Well,
with?
it's something that I was thinking about also. I look at and I pre-flight my airplane, and like I think I've said this before, I get back from my annual, and one mechanic says it's fine, and then I take it to another mechanic because something's broken, and they say, "Did this just come out of annual? How did it get out of annual like this?" And some mechanics, do they just like to dog on each other, or find some reason that you should see them, not the other mechanic? Uh, is that
So
something?
yes and no, right? Like This we live in a field where there's a certain amount of formal training that goes into being a mechanic, and it is, I would say, fairly limited. I mean, it's extensive in terms of the amount of time you have to spend, the amount of energy, and in some cases, money that you have to spend in doing it. But compared to what you really need in the field to work on all these different planes, it's a drop in the bucket. And the reality is, people end up getting focused on the things they were taught. And so
Mm,
one person
yeah.
is really tuned in to one specific thing, like rigging an aircraft.
Your clevis
Uh,
bolts are rusting.
exactly. Your clevis bolts. I remember that happened with you. Your clevis bolts are rough.
Yeah.
Um, everyone's got their thing, and that's
Yeah.
a shame because they really should have a little more universal, open-ended things. What happens in that environment is that hopefully every shop meets the basic requirements of absolute for airworthiness, of absolute, that should not be compromising between shops. That said, when a shop sees a plane for the first time, they look at the things
Yeah.
that they are used to looking at. And if
Yeah.
that is not attended to, even if it's not an airworthiness item, they go, "Oh my God, we take care of this on everything." And then you bring
Right.
it to another shop. I swear, if you took your plane, a plane, one shop to another, from literally from one annual inspection to another,
There'll
you
be
would
something wrong every
probably
time.
never find a shop that just signed it off without a
Yeah,
problem.
that's probably true. That's probably true.
I used to
So,
have someone that used to tell me there is no such thing as an airworthy aircraft. And
like
don't
there's no
ever
such
take
thing as
your
a perfect leg flying.
well, don't ever take your plane to a mechanic who says those words. I'll just tell you that right now.
Well, yeah, and I think so. It sounds to me what I'm hearing is I want an experienced mechanic, someone who's been around the block and seen a lot of things and maybe parsed out what's important from what he learned and what's maybe trivial. I think
Sure,
that's,
and there is an advantage to changing shops every once in a while. Maybe not in
yeah,
our current climate, where finding
yeah,
a shop is a nightmare and getting your
yeah,
airplane worked on is a nightmare. But in an ideal world, like why not have a new set of eyes look at something? Just keep in mind that you're
yeah.
going to be getting some airworthiness and some opinion and experience of where they focus
I
their
mean, they
training.
probably got their training on, with some kind of FaceTime thing going on or some video
Oh,
with
don't even
somebody
start that.
with somebody watching them from another city. I'm kidding. Kidding. There's one other thing I wanted to bring up because I did recently give a flight review and I saw pilots 172 and we're cruising along. So we talked about a soft field landing or takeoff. I mean, so now the soft field landing, I noticed that the pilot trimmed nose up with the electric trim wheel as they were holding the nose off. And I just wanted to point this out a little bit that while that might make it easier to hold the wheel, and if that's the goal, by all means, go ahead and do it. If your goal is to protect the nose wheel and keep it off the ground as long or out of the sand, if you're making an emergency landing on the beach or soft field, as long as possible, you want as much surface as you can. Trim nose down. And I said,
Right.
let's try this again. Watch me make this next soft field landing. And I trim full nose down while I'm holding the nose off. And it's adding that extra trim tab up on the elevator, giving me a little bit more elevator. Now I'm holding a lot of force. Why? Because I'm doing some work, holding that tail down, holding the nose off. And I was able to hold the nose off the ground till about, I don't know, 10 or 15, maybe 20 knots. So just something to
That's a
file away.
great point. That's an excellent point. And of course, we're talking about things where we're not talking about like spring assist or anything like that. We're talking about
Right. Or a
actually,
stabulator.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about the
Right.
actual control surface.
Yeah.
And the idea
Exactly.
is if you move that trim where it's helping you pull back like a normal landing, you're actually taking away, right? What's it do? It moves an anti-servo trim, goes the other way,
Yeah.
forcing it up. It's giving you exactly the opposite. You want all the
Yeah.
force because that's the
Right.
leverage.
Yeah. So you get your elevator up and then you put your trim tab nose down trim, get you a little bit more up trim tab. That makes a bigger elevator. That's why it's harder to hold because you're doing more work.
I love that. Absolutely
Good
fantastic.
stuff. So what are we halfway through so far? Oh my gosh.
Brian, it's an end of another one of our shows. This is, I tell you, I
It's
learn
crazy.
more from you every time we get together. And I just get to this point and I'm like, man, how do we make this a longer show? This is crazy.
I learn how little I know about my airplane, and I just wish, one time when we get together out here, I want you to just walk around my airplane with me. We are going to do that because I'm going to give you your tail wheel check out so you can fly that thing behind you.
Yes.
Yes, and we're going to do a tour of that. I think everybody wants to see that. I know I want to see it, but I want you to walk around my airplane with me and just teach me some stuff. Let's take the cowl off. And I just would love to spend that hour with you doing that.
I'd absolutely love to do that, and I cannot
Yeah.
wait to go flying with you there and learn because I will tell you I'm intimidated at doing that because I just look at it and think to myself, oh my God, like you're gonna point out everything
But
I'm
here's
doing.
your
I want to
homework. I
get
want you
better, so don't get me
to,
wrong.
yeah,
I am
you'll
all
love
in.
it. And here's your homework. Just go to Target or Walmart, load up a shopping cart with a couple cases of water, turn it around, and just push it around the store backwards. Have some fun with that. Try different speeds. Try making some steep turns. You'll learn how to taxi a tail dragger.
I'm in. I'm all in. Back in the days that I had a Grumman, when we had our big fly-ins, they
Yeah.
used to do something they called the broken tow bar contest.
Oh,
Okay, so you're talking about this was turning a Grumman, which has a castering nose wheel,
yeah.
into a tail dragger by grabbing it by the prop and pushing it backwards along a course without
Oh my
allowing
God.
that
Yeah.
to flip around. So I feel like I'm not necessarily up to the challenge of getting in there and using rudder pedals, but I feel
Yeah.
like I sort of know what's coming and how challenging it's going to be. And I'm a little nervous, but I'm looking forward to it.
Well, it's like riding a bike. Once you get it, you're going to love it. You'll love it. It'll be easier than you think, but we'll make it fun.
Perfect. Well, why don't we tell people about what's coming after this next? And I'll just kind of go in actual date order because we've got a bunch of really, really cool things.
Yeah.
Next Tuesday, January 21st on Social Flight Live, we have a really cool show, Inventing the Air Cam and Talking Rotax. Phil Lockwood of Lockwood Aviation is going to come on.
Cool.
I'm telling you, this is not a gentleman who comes on a lot of shows. He
Dude, you
is
get the coolest people on your
soft-spoken.
shows. I want a copy of your phone address book. I would just love to have a copy. I just think like to look at your address book on your phone.
I simplified it. I have little categories for everything now. I have A for astronauts, I have BA for Blue Angels,
Yeah.
and I have BS for Brian and Barry Schiff.
Oh, I have a category, but it's not for astronauts.
Yeah, yeah, just says Jeff Simon. So
Right.
January 21st, Inventing the Air Cam, okay, with Phil Lockwood. That's going to be fun. January 28th, Scott Intake Cartvet. He is a fighter pilot, a Blue Angels pilot, wrote the book Full Throttle. I mean, oh man, this is another legendary guy. Go to socialflightlive.com to register for that. Then we are back here on Tuesday, February 11th with another Cockpit2Cowl. And then the show that trumps all this stuff, the Schiff Show. The Schiff Show is here on February 13th, and you can
Right.
see a listing of all of these shows on socialflight.com. So be sure to check out socialflight.com. All of these are there. If you are not already going to the Schiff Show, let me tell you, Brian, man, I'm in
It's
awe.
full of shit. No, it's a great show. It's a great platform. We've got a lot of positive feedback on it. Coming up with some great topics. It's a variety show where we look at an accident, we talk about the regs involved, with the teaching techniques involved, and we look at all the things in a very open and conversational manner, kind of like this. But you've involuntarily learned a lot just by watching and participating with that. It's been a lot of fun. Little game show at the end, and we will have prizes for that eventually.
Awesome. Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
to everyone who signed on this evening, thank you so, so much for taking time to join us here this evening on Cockpit2Cowl. We really, really enjoy it, and we're thrilled that you come and spend this time with both of us. And we hope to continue this on and keep coming up with really good topics and fun things to chat about. And Brian, thanks for everything that I learn from you every time we have this show.
Likewise, likewise. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next month.
Good night.
Good night.